Welcome to Carnegie Mellon Online. For more multimedia from Carnegie Mellon University, visit www.cmu.edu/multimedia.
My name is Larry Patrick. Welcome to Carnegie Mellon University. I, along with Renee Roy, who is out in the hallway, and I'm sure most of you know Renee, are teaching a course at Carnegie Mellon entitled Urban Farming and the Environment. Tonight we are exploring the second of two public lectures, the second of four public lectures, dealing with local economy and urban farming. Some of you may have been present about a month ago for James Quilligan, when James came and gave us our inaugural lecture on that topic. So we're continuing tonight with the presence of Michael Shuman. I want to recognize just a few people in the room before we get started. I want to recognize Indira Nair, our undergraduate provost, because none of this would happen without Indira's total support for all courses green on campus, and from my perspective, the urban farming course would never have flowered without Professor Nair's support. So I want to acknowledge her presence and her dedication to the environment. The co-sponsors for the, or the co-organizers, I should say, for the public lecture series is Fernando Tordosa, who will be introducing Michael, Mary Beth, Steislinger, Renee, and Michael Krjovic, also here in the front row. I'd like to list or announce the supporters for the public lecture series, if I may, and they are as follows. Carnegie Mellon's Heinz School of Policy and Public Policy and Management. East End Food Co-op, I saw Rob here a moment ago. FAPEN, Economic and Development Council, and Michael Krjovic is CEO of that. Green Block Farm, is anybody here from Green Block Farm? Yeah. Okay, I think you count double ones. Grow Pittsburgh, I know Miriam is here. She told me that the entire Grow Pittsburgh staff is here, so welcome to Grow Pittsburgh. Penn State Extension, Dino. Anybody from Penn State? They are also supporters of this public lecture series. The Greenbow, through Fernando. Urban Ecological Collaborative, again to Mary Beth Steislinger, and to the Urban Farming Initiative. Is Carol Walsh here? Hi, Carol. Okay, so those are the supporters to the public lecture series. Now here's the big question. I'd like to recognize all urban farmers, just by name. Mildred's daughter. Rhonda and Barbara are not here. Hillcrest Farm. Maria, are you here? Hillcrest Farm. Braddock Farm. I know Jeff is here. Garden Dreams, Mindy Schwartz. I know you are here. Landslide Farm. Is anyone here from our urban farm, Landslide Farm? Hmong Dynasty. Chris, I know you're here. Bidwell Center. Anybody? Okay. Thank you for your presence. Green Block Farm, I've already asked about. Blackberry Farm, some Perry Urban Farms. Anybody here from Blackberry Farm? Perry Urban. And I even understand there's somebody here from Cool Springs Organic out in Butler County. So we've pulled in a few farmers who are a little bit beyond the city. How many students are here from the urban farming class? Show of hands there. There better be 22 hands. All right. Okay. All right, we're going to get to the introduction of Michael here in a moment. He did make the request that I highlighted on the back table are some books and publications of various things dealing with Small-Mart Revolution. So please check them out on your way out. And also, speaking of the back of the room, there will be some light refreshments afterwards, so do hang around, mingle, especially you urban farming students. Get over and actually meet the heroines, the uncommon heroines of Pittsburgh, the urban farmers who are growing food for the very people who need it. Okay. So here we go. When I was putting this course together early summer, I kept getting CC emails from Fernando and Mary Beth about local economy. I couldn't understand why I was being CC'd, but it was happening, and about that time I was putting this course together in my head, trying to figure out how urban farming should be taught this time around, and what came to me was urban farming within the context of local economy. So I got Mary Beth and Fernando, soon Michael, and as soon as Renee got back from Oxford, we got together and planned this series of public lectures around the theme of local economy. So James Quilligan gave us the idea that there were many ideas, one of which was the simultaneous solution of some of our problems being found both at the commons level, the public commons level, at the international scale, and also at the local scale. So that's what we're going to be looking at tonight, one of those scales. Tonight's theme is local economy. So I will turn things over to Fernando, who will introduce Michael Shuman.
Thank you, Larry. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. I know you guys in the front can hear me okay. So, okay, fantastic. Good evening, everybody. Really thrilled to be here. When Larry first brought up the idea of trying to put together the lecture series together, I kind of wondered to myself, boy, no, I'm not even from around here. I'm not from Pittsburgh, and he's talking about trying to do something that deals with local economies. And I got to tell you, you give me something to plant on the ground and I'll kill it. I just don't have that kind of a thumb. So when the theme of the lecture became local economies and urban farming, I just had no clue as to what it is that we could actually put together, or definitely what it is that I could contribute. But both Mary Beth and Larry helped me see the light. And one of the things that they helped me understand is that through the correspondences that he was describing, I've been at Rubio Valley, the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, for a number of years. I've essentially really loved the concept of what they've been doing all over the country, and always wonder what it is that, someday, how is it that we could find the opportunity to actually have that type of conversation here in the Pittsburgh area. So as Mary Beth and Larry began to explain what's actually happening within the farming and the agriculture area sector here in Pittsburgh, and also their particular interest, and I got to tell you, kudos to CMU for sort of seeing what's beyond the horizon when it comes together, when it comes to local economies. It just became sort of an inescapable opportunity. I had been at the Valley annual conference in 2006 and had the opportunity to meet a couple of the founders of the organization, and Michael Shuman is one of the co-founders. So I was very impressed with what I saw, what I heard him say, what I heard other people say about him, and also Judy Wicks, which is the other founder. And by the way, a little secret, Judy Wicks is originally from Pittsburgh, and she's going to be the speaker in the April series lecture. So please do mark your calendar for April 29th, same time as tonight. It's going to be a homecoming for her. It didn't matter that I'm not originally from Pittsburgh. I think the definition of the term local is whatever the heart is. And we, my wife and my two sons, we've been here since 1985, and we just love this region. It's absolutely, we wouldn't trade it for anything. And that is a sentiment, quite frankly, that I also get from lots of immigrants that I know from different parts of the world, not just from South America. I'm originally from Peru. Pittsburgh is a place that you just can't help but to love. And so when you marry the concepts of local living and economies with the concept of agriculture, especially urban farming, which is such a powerful concept for urban regions that are trying to redefine themselves. And Pittsburgh does seem to have an interesting opportunity on that regard. It just became, as I said earlier, inescapable to try to help with this particular enterprise. So here I am tonight, and again, kudos to CMU and to really the cadre of grassroots organizers who just, with very little hint and clues, decided to just kind of pony up to help us pull this thing here tonight. When I asked Michael Shuman for his bio, I was totally staggered. There were 2.5 pages of stuff, so I said, I'm not going to read all this stuff. But I ended up summarizing some of the things that I think you just need to hear what Michael has in his near-term history. Him and I were about the same age, so I know that he hasn't lived that long, but long enough to have a couple of things, golden things to share with us. He's an attorney and economist, and currently the Vice President of for Enterprise Development at the Training and Development Corporation, which is actually based in the state of Maine. He is the former Director of the Institute of Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., co-founder of the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, or VALI, and is a recipient of a Kellogg National Leadership Fellowship. He is the author of 7 books, including Small-Mart Revolution, which is the essence of what you're going to hear tonight. The other book that is one that probably should be on many of your reference bookshelves is Going Local, Creating Self-Reliant Communities in the Global Age. He has written articles for many publications, including The Nation, The Weekly Standard, The New York Times, and The Washington Post. And he's a frequent commentator in National Public Radio's All Things Considered. He has had rather extensive and provocative instigations, I will call them, in all aspects of public service, social justice, economic equity, particularly exploring people, practices, and policies in diverse fields such as technology, national security, citizen diplomacy, municipal and foreign policy, entrepreneurship, philanthropy, and business development. And again, given our time constraints here tonight, I'm definitely would not be able to do justice to some of the phenomenal things that he has been able to accomplish in those areas. But I do encourage to look him up on the internet. He's well placed in Google. And I want to encourage you to be deeply inspired by some of the things that he has been able to put out there. He's a graduate of Stanford University, we'll forgive him that, and Stanford Law School. And he presently lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife and his 2 children, who by now have totally understood why it is that their daddy never took them to McDonald's. Please help me welcome Michael Shuman.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. And Larry, thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the sponsors and all of you folks for coming tonight. I know there are many competing things nibbling away at all of our attentions here. There's one piece that Fernando did not reveal about my resume. He may not know this, but really my start in the local food movement came in my first job when I was an undergraduate at Stanford, desperate for money. I actually took a job for 2 weeks with the IT&T Corporation promoting Twinkies at the local supermarket. And I had to dress in yellow tights and a big plywood Twinkie the Kid costume and go up to people and say, do you know that Twinkies are now individually wrapped for freshness? So I've come a long way, you could say, to get to local food. And maybe that story will inspire other recalcitrants, whether they're sitting in your audience or sitting in your living room from time to time. I've titled tonight's talk, Saving the World by Eating Local. And what I wanted to do is do a kind of a blend between big themes that I cover in the Small-Mart Revolution and a lot of the themes around local food that I see happening around the country. The starting place in my worldview is that we are in a huge wrestling bout between two archetypes of capitalism. And I give them women's names, Tina and Lois. Tina comes from Maggie Thatcher's invocation, "There is no alternative to the global economy," T-I-N-A. And I think it's fair to say that over the last generation, economic developers and politicians, and really irrespective of party and political leanings, have embraced Tina. And it really has come down to three essential mantras. The first is get Toyota to locate in your backyard, so an attraction and retention paradigm. Whenever you hear the words attraction and retention, since it's focused on non-local business, you should immediately think, this is part of Tina. The second part of Tina is prioritizing export-led development, the belief that this is where real wealth comes from. And the third part of Tina is convincing local businesses, like many sitting in the room here, local farmers, that even though this policy doesn't directly touch you, it actually is all in your interest. So, sit back, buckle up, and enjoy the ride. There is an alternative, and that alternative is LOIS, for locally owned and import substituting development. This is not a LOIS here. This is Jane Jacobs, great urban economist, recently deceased. And I think those of you who are familiar with her work will hear many of the themes from her books echoing in what I want to share with you this evening. Local ownership is, I think we all know it when we see it. It means 51% ownership and control within a given locale. Import substitution is saying, really, if you can produce a good and a service locally, it makes sense to do so rather than import it for a bunch of reasons, some of which we'll go into, some of which we can talk about in Q&A. So really we're talking about creating self-reliance, moving the economy toward diversification. Now, out of this movement of LOIS has come what Fernando already identified, the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, or BALE, founded in the year 2001. It has since grown to, I think we're now at 60 cities around the United States. There are 15,000 businesses that are formally members, local businesses, but in fact, if you look at what the local business population is in those 60 communities, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of businesses, if not millions. And the ideas that these businesses and these BALE networks are embracing are that the strongest economy, for reasons we will discuss, is one that maximizes local ownership. Second idea is that the strongest economy is going to be one that simultaneously is as self-reliant as possible and is engaged in the global economy. And if you think about it, sell everything you can to local consumers and sell everything you can to the world, that is the definition of a successful economy. And if you take either of those pieces away, the economy loses something. I think one of the mistakes of mainstream economic development has been the belief that if you focus on the non-local markets, the local markets will take care of themselves. When in fact, I think there is a growing body of evidence that the causality actually goes in the other direction, that a strong local market will give birth naturally to businesses that project themselves globally. The last piece of BALE is that we're not interested in any old businesses, we're interested in local businesses that aspire to higher labor and environmental standards. I am sure there are people sitting in this audience tonight who are nervous, if not antagonistic, toward companies that begin with names like Wall or Home or Star. I'm among them, but that is not what this talk or these ideas or this movement is all about. This is not an oppositional movement. This is a movement for building stronger, more competitive networks of local businesses and rendering the other points moot. Over the next 50, 55 minutes or so, I want to share 4 big ideas with you. One is I want to give you 4 good reasons why we should be embracing local, why we should be embracing LOIS rather than TINA. I want to talk about why LOIS is a lot more competitive than we think and share some data with you on that. I want to talk about some of the emerging business strategies that food businesses in particular are using to take advantage of this trend and competitiveness of LOIS. And then I want to talk about some emerging community strategies. This obviously should be a 4. I'm editing myself here. Some of you may remember about it, I guess it was last March, April, that Time magazine had this cover story, Forget Organic, Eat Local. It was a terrible article, but it was great that this reached the cover of Time magazine. I mean, clearly the zeitgeist moment has arrived. Why has it arrived? Well, I think there is a growing body of evidence that not all businesses contribute equally to the well-being of a community. Now, what I want to do is I want to share with you a bunch of data and studies that show the superior performance of local businesses when it comes to community well-being over non-local businesses. I'm not saying that the non-local businesses are bad or immoral, just that objectively speaking, they don't contribute as much to income, wealth, and jobs. This is a study that was done shortly before I debated the head of economic development for Lane County, Oregon in 2003. And I was very fortunate that the local paper looked at about 5 years of this guy's tax abatements that he had awarded in the many millions of dollars to a bunch of companies in support of economic development. And what this newspaper article found was that 95% of the subsidies went to 6 non-local TINA businesses. 3 came, took the benefits, and within a year or 2 shut down the factories and moved elsewhere to another global jurisdiction on the planet. 2 came, stuck around, but under-delivered the jobs they promised. 1 was more or less on target. The other 5% of the subsidies went to about 100 local businesses. They made very modest job promises and pretty much kept the promises that they made. The bottom line was stunning because in tax abatement terms, the cost of a LOIS job was $2,000. The cost of all of the jobs that TINA produced over this period was about $22,000. But remember, some of those jobs came and went. So in net job terms, it was $67,000 per job to get a job from TINA. It was more than 30 times more expensive to do a TINA job strategy than a LOIS job strategy. Now, was that just an accident and bad luck for Central Oregon? Well, maybe. But I actually think that there are some real things that are going on with local businesses that almost always will generate superior economic performance. The first is local businesses don't move. They stick around for many years, often for many generations. This is kind of my exhibit A. This is a cheesehead. Many of you recognize. A cheesehead is a rabid fan of the Green Bay Packers. And the Packers are important because they are the only team in the National Football League not owned by a single obnoxious individual. So while many teams come and go with their cities threatening to leave like Art Modell did with Cleveland, if you don't build them a stadium and give them a couple of tens of millions of dollars of bribery, off they go. There will never be Baltimore Packers. The Packers are there to stay. The Packers have generated hundreds of millions of dollars of wealth for Green Bay and will continue to do so. Why? Because they are locally owned. Thousands of residents in Wisconsin have shares of the Green Bay Packers, and that is why the Packers will never leave Green Bay. So it helps to underscore why it is local ownership produces a steady stream of wealth that's less reliable when it comes to TINA. The flip side of that is that many TINA companies, when they see a global opportunity, lower wages, looser environmental standards, closer to natural resources, whatever, they move abroad. Well, this can inflict catastrophe on a community. I first got involved with the Training and Development Corporation in 2002 because a paper mill in the middle of Maine had just shut down. This was a big paper mill in a town called Millinocket. And it threw the last 1,400 people out of work there. It was not a locally owned mill. It was owned by a company in Canada, and the Canadians decided they wanted to create another mill somewhere else, lower labor costs. This was a huge catastrophe for mid-Maine. Over the next year, the unemployment level in mid-Maine was 40%. It was as if a nuclear bomb went off in that economy. Now, I know you don't have to look far in the history of this region to see similar things that have happened. And what you can say as a kind of summary of all of this is that if you build your economic development around big TINA companies that will come and go, you're taking a huge risk, a huge gamble. The more that you practice economic development that is rooted in locally owned businesses, it is an insurance policy against this kind of catastrophe tripping you up down the road. Now, there's another piece of this too. Local ownership also means that the company is likely to be more responsible. And here's what I mean by that. Suppose, hypothetically, the Green Bay Packers had to pay a living wage. The city of Green Bay said everyone in the city, including the hot dog sellers and the ticket collectors, has to be paid a living wage of $10+ per hour. Well, would the Green Bay Packers suddenly pick up and leave? They wouldn't be happy about this, but would they leave? No, they can't leave because they're locally owned, they're locally controlled. The more of your economy that is locally owned and rooted means that you can raise labor and environmental standards politically with confidence that those businesses are going to adapt rather than flee. The second factor that differentiates local businesses, they have higher economic multipliers. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, the economic multiplier is the nuts and bolts of economic development. It means I spend $1 at a local pharmacy, people work there, they take that dollar, go to a local grocer, the local grocer is buying some produce produced locally, so we have $1 in circulation. The faster this dollar circulates, and the more times this dollar circulates in a community without leakage, the more income, wealth, and jobs. That's economic development 101. And it just so happens that local businesses do this a lot better than non-local businesses. This is a study that was done in Austin, Texas. about 5-6 years ago, looking at the impact of $100 spent at a local bookstore, Book People, and $100 spent at a Borders. $100 spent at the Borders led to $13 remaining in the local economy. $100 spent at the local bookstore led to $45 staying in the local economy. So roughly speaking, every time you spend $1 at the local bookstore, you get 3 times the economic impact. 3 times the jobs, 3 times the income and wealth effects, 3 times the tax benefits. We're not talking small potatoes of difference here. Why was there a difference? Well, the Borders did not have a high-level management team on the ground. The local bookstore did. The Borders did not advertise in local radio and television. The local bookstore did. The Borders did not use local business services like lawyers and accountants. The local bookstore did. The Borders did not have a stream of local profits coming into the community. The local bookstore did. So you just take those 4 line items, and you easily can come up with 10, 15, 20% or more of the expenditure by a business. And you start to generalize from that, and you realize it would truly be an unusual comparison between a local and a non-local business of doing the same thing, where you would get a higher multiplier from the non-local business. So here's a bunch of other studies that tell us exactly the same thing. A study in Iowa State about 1.5 years ago. If you build an ethanol plant in Iowa with no local ownership, you get 140 jobs. If you increase the ownership to 73% local, because of the multiplier impact, you more than double the number of jobs in the state to over 300. Here's a study from San Francisco last May, looking at the impact of a 10% shift in retail expenditure from chain to local. If San Franciscans did that, they would create something like 1,700 new jobs and $200 million more of economic output. Or to put this in more depressing terms, if San Franciscans were foolish enough to move 10% of their expenditures from local to chain, they would lose those jobs and lose $200 million of economic impact. Here's a study that I did in Detroit last June. I asked the question, suppose we were to shift 20% of people's expenditure inside the city of Detroit to local food, food grown by urban farmers and the like, and processed by urban-based food businesses in Detroit. And, what we found is that we would get, an enormous impact, something like $500 million, $500 million more of output, significant more in earnings and taxes that come into Detroit. And if 5 counties said, look, we really want to help Detroit get back on its feet, and we're going to do it by buying Detroit grown, if 20% of the expenditure shifted, you would get $3.5 billion more into the Detroit economy. And in job terms, just the Detroit shift would lead to 5,000 more jobs. In the 5-county area, we're talking about 35,000 more jobs. Even in a city the size of Detroit, that would have a sizable impact on unemployment. And those kinds of numbers certainly would be true for this region as well. Now, I want to pause for a second about the message that I'm giving you on these data. We now have more than a dozen studies over the last 10 years that all show that focusing economic development on local businesses is significantly more useful for the economy, significantly more affordable than doing non-local businesses. And there's a message in there. There's a message that public policy, I think, needs to focus on. because there's a temptation to say, well, we're going to do some local, some non-local. But public policy doesn't allow that kind of, loose use of money. I mean, think of it. Well, we'll have some like old gas-guzzling cars, and we'll have some new hybrids. So we'll have a diversity of fleet out there. No. You do the thing that works the best. And we now know that local works the best. And so the burden of proof really is on those who would do economic development the old way on why you would spend any money on non-local business. The third distinction about local businesses is that they have a character and a size that is consistent with the kind of cutting-edge theories of economic development. So smart growth, the idea of having walkable communities and doing more with existing space so you protect green spaces and farmland. Well, if you think about it, you just can't do a walkable community in a big box hellhole. It spatially doesn't work. Nor can you do a big industrial park and make it a walkable community. A walkable community really requires attention to the size and the character of businesses, increasingly small, increasingly home-based. Cool downtowns. What is it that drives tourists into an economy? Well, this is the insignia of Austin, Texas's business community, the Keep Austin Weird campaign. Now, you might use a somewhat different set of insignias in Pittsburgh, or not. But if you think about it, what is it that draws tourists? In Austin, it's one-of-a-kind restaurants, nightclubs, hotels. Or put it another way, no one goes to Houston as a tourist, which is a big box hellhole, right? There may be many reasons to go to Houston, but tourism would not be one of them. So if you're interested in tourism in your economy, you want to nurture the local and the unique characteristics. And this is the same logic behind your favorite son, Richard Florida's creative economy arguments. I mean, I believe that at the end of the day, the creative economy is mostly about LOIS. There may be 5 degrees of difference between Florida's view of this and mine. But a creative economy really says, how do we keep people like you in the audience, the best, the brightest, the most entrepreneurial, people who are recent graduates of great universities, how do we keep them here? If you have an economy that is primarily built on hamburger flippers, people turning nuts and bolts on an assembly line, checkout clerks, that's the antithesis of a creative economy. A creative economy is one where every single person with a dream of setting up his or her own local business has the opportunity to do so. And that's why LOIS is a critical piece of the creative economy. Now, the last point I want to mention is that LOIS firms uniquely can help us reduce carbon footprints. I put this picture of the lamb up here because there was a guy named McWilliams who wrote a stunningly poor op-ed in the New York Times. We now know how the New York Times fact checkers are, given McCain's stuff. But they wrote a stunningly bad op-ed that said, it turns out, this is sort of his words, I'm paraphrasing, it turns out that local lamb in the United Kingdom has 4 times the carbon footprint of New Zealand lamb. And therefore, the people in the UK should abandon local lamb and import lots of New Zealand lamb. What I don't even think McWilliams knew was that this study was commissioned by the New Zealand lamb export industry. What he also didn't realize is, and I confirm this by emailing back and forth with the study's authors, they didn't look at local lamb at all. They compared bionic lamb in New Zealand, badly done pesticides, fertilizers, with badly done lamb in the United Kingdom. And it turns out that because the pesticides and fertilizers in New Zealand are fed by hydropower, which is clean, and the pesticides and fertilizers are fed by coal power in the UK, the bionic lambs in the UK fared very badly. I focus on this just because, there's a lot of these sort of cutesy, counterfactual, counterlogic studies that are floating around, and when you undress them, they have huge holes in them. Because logically, it is apparent to a third grader that local food that doesn't have enormous food miles embedded in it is going to carry a lower carbon footprint than non-local food. And the same is true in most local goods. It would truly be an extraordinary distinction. And one of the things about globalization, if a community figures out, if a community in Mongolia figures out how are we going to produce this particular good with an exceptionally low amount of carbon, globalization means that technology will spread around the planet instantly. And every community will have access to it. So it is extremely hard to envision any community having a carbon advantage in trade. Self-reliance is the carbon advantage. Moving the economy toward localization is where you can achieve the successfully low carbon footprint. Now, the arguments that I get against all of this, the pushback, is actually not on the arguments that I've presented to you. I mean, there are people, holdouts out there who disagree with some of the things that I've said, but I've been surprised that very few economists have challenged me on what I've just shared with you. What they come back with, though, is they say, okay, you're right that if we have a local good and a non-local good, same quality, price, accessibility, yes, if we buy local, you'll get the multiplier effect, you'll get the wealth effects, you'll get the smart growth, creative economy, tourist effects, low carbon footprint, but we live in a world where bigger is better. Bigger box is cheaper. Bigger businesses achieve better economies of scale. And so you're talking about local goods that are more expensive. So I want to take this on, and it reminds me a little bit of one of my favorite movies growing up. Many of you probably have never seen this. It's Bambi versus Godzilla. And the essence of the movie, the way that I think about it here, is that Bambi is kind of the small local businesses out there, the urban farms, and then there's the Godzilla of globalization. And in this film's depiction, it's a 1-minute film. That's it for Bambi. The way that this argument plays out is really 4 different variations on a theme. One argument says, well, local businesses are a rare part of the economy. They're the backwater, the old economy. Why would you focus on them? Another argument says most small businesses fail. Why should we put our eggs in the failing basket? Most small businesses can't innovate, and they certainly can't compete globally. So let's take these apart a little bit. The first about local businesses being a rare part of the economy. In point of fact, if you look at the US gross domestic product, about half of the private sector is small and local. 6% of the economy is nonprofit, cooperatives, hospitals, universities. Chances are very good Carnegie Mellon is not going to move to China. And then there are, the governmental institutions, local and state and federal. You add that all up, that's 58% of GDP. 58% of GDP is place-based. The majority of the economy is place-based. The majority of the competitive economy is place-based. So it's the minority that needs some explaining. And in point of fact, there are many things that economists leave out because we don't know how to count them, like stay-at-home parents, like people who take care of the elderly, like the volunteer sector, like the black market. You start adding all of these things together, and really in a typical part of the US economy, 80% of the activity that goes on today is local. And it starts to underscore why any economic development policy that focuses on the non-local 20% is fundamentally misplaced. It's too small a part of the economy to draw our interest. We should be focusing on the biggest part of the economy. What about the argument that most small businesses fail? Not true. What we've heard is something else, and we haven't paid attention to it. Most small business startups fail. Most large business startups fail. Most of all startups fail. But that doesn't mean that in any given year, most small businesses are failing. In the most recent year that I had data available for the Small-Mart book, there were 32,000 more small business births than deaths, and 200 more large business deaths than births. Those are numbers that would surprise some people. Most small businesses can't innovate? Hardly. SBA data suggests that 60 to 80% of all new jobs are coming from smaller businesses. 13 to 14 times more patents per unit of business are in small businesses. What about the larger issue of competitiveness? I want to approach this question a little bit differently than you might have thought about it. Every year, the US government catalogs all businesses in our economy in what is called the North American Industrial Classification System, NACE, 1,300 categories. And it also says, what's the size of these businesses? Well, if you ask the question, in how many of these 1,300 categories do we have more examples of successful large businesses than small businesses? The answer is a whopping 7. In other words, in 1,293 categories, we have more examples of successful small businesses than large businesses. Now, what are those 7 categories that are really hard to localize? Well, number 1 is running a centralized monetary system. Okay, we'll concede that one. Number 2 is running a nuclear power plant. We can see why in Florida today. Number three is rockets and missiles. And surely if there was a category that would be hard to envision localization of, it would be one with an intergalactic mission, right? And yet, in this category, we have 10 businesses nationally, and 4 of them are small and locally owned. So that one turns out to be open to you. My point here is that economists tend to be very cavalier on this economy of scale issue. It almost sounds like, someone has gone up to, Mount Sinai and pulled the tablets down, and Moses, thou shalt not do small-scale manufacturing. It doesn't work that way. The clever entrepreneur and the smart economic developer looks for great examples of small-scale success in every single sector of the economy and puts those into motion. Because there is truly almost no sector out there that you cannot have small-scale, globally competitive success if you shop around carefully and wisely enough. Now, nevertheless, our view of globalization is a much more pernicious one. We see ourselves being steamrolled by the Walmarts, the Home Depots, the Starbucks, the PetSmarts. Now, everything I just mentioned to you is retail. And here is something that people do not realize. Even though retail seems like a huge part of our economy, it's where we encounter it, retail is 7% of our economy. And it's true that in retail, small businesses have really taken a beating over the last 10 years, although not as big as you think. In non-retail, small businesses have actually done really well. And overall, if you look at like what percentage of the gross domestic product has gone to small versus large, small businesses have lost only about 3 or 4% of ground over the last decade. That's a much smaller number than we assume. And it's mostly a big loss in certain retail categories, counterbalanced by some small gains in a bunch of other categories that small businesses had. Now, you could still look at that 3 to 4% loss that small business has experienced and say, all right, well, that is evidence that small businesses are less competitive. Maybe. But let's entertain some other hypotheses about why small businesses have had a hard time of it. The first is that every single year, state and local governments, including your own, have given an estimated $50 billion for attraction or retention. Now, as I said earlier on, attraction and retention is a code phrase for non-local, because it doesn't make sense to attract or retain a local business. It's a non sequitur. The feds, as I look at their pork barrel stuff that's going on, probably are giving $63 billion a year to non-local business. That's $113 billion of pork each year. And one way to look at this is that these are subsidies, the result of which, if not the purpose, is to make local business less competitive. The second thing to think about, equities bias. I know a lot of people here are young and you're not thinking about pension funds yet, but by show of hands here, how many people bank local? Okay, some probably looks like about 2/3. Okay, by show of hands here, those of you who have pension funds that you're aware of, how many of you have those pension funds investing local? Now notice the difference. And that difference is actually quite significant because banking is only 1/6 of the financial universe of the US. The other 5/6 are stocks, bonds, mutual funds, hedge funds, venture funds, and there is no local content in that whatsoever. The reason turns out to be we have securities laws that were enacted in the early Jurassic period that make it extremely expensive for small businesses to attract small investors. They have to hire $50,000 to $100,000 worth of lawyers to paper the transaction. It's absurd that we have that requirement. But the result is a bias in the equities market. Half of the economy, of the private economy, is small local business. Half the competitive economy is small local business. And they get almost none of the equity funds out there from our pensions or mutual funds. That is what economists might dryly observe is a market failure. It is a misallocation of resources. It means all of us in this room who, I'd say maybe 90% seem to be localistas or localvores of one kind or another. All of us in this room are over-investing in Fortune 500 companies and neglecting local businesses that we know are essential for our well-being. And then there are a bunch of other little things, like buy a book from a local bookstore, pay a sales tax. Buy it from Amazon, no sales tax. 25 years ago, if Walmart was doing what it was doing today with its suppliers, they would be hauled off to the pokey for antitrust violations. Today, we give them a free pass. We could spend all day going through all of the biases that are tilted like a double diamond ski slope against local business. So let's put this all in perspective. $113 billion of pork each year that's making small local business less competitive. Equities laws that are wrecking the ability of small businesses to capture investment, and all of these other public policies that are biased against local business. No wonder local businesses have lost 3 or 4%. Or let's put it a different way. It's a miracle they only lost 3 or 4%. It shows how resilient the sector is, that despite all of the efforts of public policy to destroy these businesses, they continue. If we got public policy half right over the last decade, there never would have been this 3 or 4% loss in their market share. And if we get public policy half right in the next 10 years, you will see a small-mart revolution. Because there are a lot of trends out there that are happening nationally and globally that are making small more and more competitive. Here's one trend. It's a golden arch, French fries, and the words locally owned. This is a poster that McDonald's commissioned in the central terminal of National Airport. Apparently McDonald's wants you to feel like when you order your Big Mac, you're kind of sort of supporting the local economy, man, you know? and you know, this is how they think they're gonna sell things, right? And look at these other examples of local wash. HSBC, the world's local bank. ROK, the nation's local builder. ShopLocal.com, without a single local business inside of it. Apparently we're onto something, because as soon as consumers discover, like, this isn't the real thing, they're going to move to what is the real thing. Consumers are beginning to move toward local because they're seeing these numbers. They're seeing the health effects and the environmental effects of local, and they're seeing the ability to deal with the carbon and climate changes in a more constructive way. Reason number 2 for optimism. Globalization often leads to great efficiencies in production, but it has led to great inefficiencies in distribution. And there is no better place to see this than in food. These numbers were developed by the former Secretary of Agriculture for the state of Maine. They're national data. And what they do is they show when you spent $1 at a market in the year 1900, 40 cents went to the farmer and the rest went to inputs and marketing. Today, extend this forward to about 2005-06, 7 cents goes to the farmer. 73 cents goes to marketing. By marketing, I mean packaging, refrigeration, advertising, middle people, trucking, things that have nothing to do with food. Well, if you think about it, whenever the marketing number gets very large relative to production, there is an opportunity for localization. Because, I mean, think about it. Take the 7 cents here, and suppose we have really inefficient local farmers. So instead of 7 cents, it's 14 cents. Well, if you've gotten rid of most of the 73 cents of garbage, you still have cheaper food. And so I think that there is an underlying economic reason why we're beginning to see an acceleration of farmers markets, urban farming, community-supported agriculture, other kinds of community food systems. It's because of the gigantic inefficiency that the global businesses are now facing. And by the way, this is going to get a lot worse. So this is my reason number 3 for optimism. This is the price of oil, West Texas crude, between 1998 and the present. Even an economist would have to concede that the price of oil is rising. Well, that's bad news for some people on a limited income, but it's great news for communities. It's great news for local food systems. It means we're going to be using our non-local cars and non-local fuels a lot less. We're going to be doing a lot more smart growth. We're going to be doing more local energy efficiency. And local production, coupled with local consumption, is going to become increasingly competitive against Walmart production in China that's bringing the goods 15,000 miles to the United States. Even, by the way, if the labor in China is free, which it almost is, because those tiny labor costs are becoming a less and less significant part of the equation, and the getting larger transportation costs are dominating the equation. So we're going to see a huge upheaval in the globalized food system over the coming generation. Reason number 4 for optimism, dead pets. You know, Chinese dog food kills, you know, thousands of US dogs. E. coli from non-local spinach infects thousands of people in the United States, and suddenly people realize, maybe there's an advantage here for local spinach. Mad cow disease coming from Canada. We are starting to see more and more reasons why consumers want to have a relationship with a farmer and want to trust where the food has come from. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about how local businesses are taking advantage of these trends, and local food businesses in particular. I don't know how many of you know this guy. This is Paul Saginaw. Paul Saginaw is the founder of Zingerman's Delicatessen in Ann Arbor. And you know, one of the things that's great about Zingerman's as a strategy for building a local business is it's a great story. Because Paul and his partner Ari, who have run this delicatessen for the better part of, I think, 25 years, made a commitment at the beginning. We are going to grow, but we're going to grow deep. We're not going to grow wide. So we're going to take the success from our delicatessen, and we're going to create related businesses. A bakery, a creamery, a wedding cake manufacturer. We're going to create a business consulting firm. We're going to create a coffee company. And they're still going. So out of this one local delicatessen, they now have a business that generates annual sales of over $30 million and employs 545 people in Ann Arbor. And they will always be a local business. Another strategy that local businesses, I think, are beginning to realize is you need to create a destination. And maybe the way to create a destination is not on your own, but it's a bunch of local businesses together, kind of a local shopping mall, as you were. This comes from one of my favorite local shopping malls in the world, the Bangkok Weekend Market, where there are 10,000 local businesses side by side. I think, you have to walk like 10 miles to see all of them. Now, when I was growing up on the South Shore of Long Island, there was a place called the Farmer's Market. It wasn't really a farmer's market. It was a big box. And it had about 100 booths inside of there. Some were food. But what it really was a lot of home-based businesses and artisans that sort of occupied those booths. As a kid, this was the place I loved to go. I mean, we had chain stores then, Pergamon and Times Square, but this was the place that was fun, where you could watch a glass blower make elaborate animals and see a magician perform tricks all day long. We need to create fun places for local businesses to be, and that becomes part of the competitive advantage. Dominating a niche. Becoming a specialty business. This is the H-E-B markets in Texas. H-E-B is a regional chain of grocery stores in Texas that have competed successfully against Walmart down there. And the way that they've done so is they've been really attentive to micro niches of their client base. Latinos, for example, they sell ingredients and cooking equipment that is very much in demand in the Latino community. Asian Americans, they have aquariums of fish for people to get live fish, for cooking. They've been focusing on very poor customers too, and figuring out what are the foodstuffs that would be particularly useful to people on an extremely limited income. And through these kinds of micro niches, local businesses do quite well, because if you think about it, chain stores almost by definition have to generalize at some mega level. Direct distribution. How do you compete against the mega mall that supposedly puts convenience in the hands of customers in one place? Well, you make it even more convenient for consumers to get foodstuffs locally. This guy runs Spud, Small Potatoes Urban Delivery System in Vancouver, British Columbia. Spud will deliver to your doorstep 300 varieties of fresh fruits and vegetables in biofueled vehicles in short order. Now, what I really want is this guy to get involved in diaper delivery. A couple months ago, my wife was traveling. I have 2 young kids. And at about 10 o'clock at night, on Saturday night, I realized I was out of diapers. I would have paid this man $100 to direct deliver me a single diaper at 10 o'clock on Saturday night. I know I can't be alone. And my point is that if we cleverly start organizing local businesses to work collaboratively together, they can set up direct delivery systems. Amazon says they'll get you a book in 24 hours. We need the local bookstore to be able to get you the book in 24 minutes. Riding the long tails. Some of you may have seen an article by Chris Anderson in Wired magazine 2-3 years ago talking about one of the things that the internet has done is it means, people who used to have tiny audiences and never could make a living at it now can actually create huge audiences in really tiny niches. So what I mean by that is, if you were a garage band in Pittsburgh, and you used to have an audience of maybe, 7 people and their canaries, now you can go all over the world and find those 7 people in tens of thousands of cities, and you have got an audience out there. So it means that more people can do more things in almost any community using global technology cleverly. Now I want to finally talk about emerging community strategies, because what I just talked about is what local businesses on their own, for the most part, can do to become more competitive. But the smartest thing for a community to do is actually to build a coalition of local businesses, as Bali has done around the country. Because local businesses together are capable of doing all of the things on this list. And they may not be capable of doing them if they're not working together. So I have it kind of in 6 Ps of planning, people, partners, purchasing, and policy making. Planning, I mean, let's identify leaks in the economy and plug them. People, how do we support either new or existing entrepreneurs? Partners, how do we build networks of local businesses that can be more competitive working together? Purse, how do we deal with this problem of equity investment getting into the hands of local businesses? Purchasing, how do we encourage consumers, businesses, public purchasing agents to buy local, or buy local first? I'll say more about that in a moment. And policy making. I have a very simple goal with public policy. Stop destroying local business. Just level the playing field. If you just did that, that's all that local businesses need. And we could save a lot of money too. Let me talk briefly about each of these, give you a sense of what I'm talking about. Local planning. The starting place of any coherent localization agenda is to identify all of those things that the community is unnecessarily buying from outside the community that are leading to leakages of dollars. Because if you can plug those leaks through locally made goods, locally provided services, you can get a whole lot of additional local multiplier. So I've done about a half dozen studies and initiatives around the country with community groups. And the longest standing one was in upstate New York in St. Lawrence County. And this commenced with St. Lawrence University, a couple of state universities in New York, and with the Chamber of Commerce up in St. Lawrence County. St. Lawrence County is the largest landmass county in upstate New York. It's one of the poorest counties in the state. They have about 100,000 people. We organized several hundred people in St. Lawrence County into teams around different sectors of the economy. And the challenge we put to them was, please identify the leaks in your sector and what are the best opportunities for new or expanded local businesses to plug those leaks. To get people started, I gave folks some data around the economy, things they may not have known. For example, land. There was 250,000 acres of vacant farmland because of recent farms that had gone bankrupt. There were 3,700 people or underemployed in St. Lawrence County, which for New York State was a relatively high percentage. There's $1 billion in banks and credit unions that in theory could be used as investment in local businesses, and I estimated another $5 billion in pension and mutual funds. So I sat down with the Food and Agriculture Group. I want to give you just one example of how the logic of this played out. And we were looking at meat leakages. Now, I know there's some vegans here, so my apologies. But if you look at the meat situation in St. Lawrence County, they import 15,000 cows worth of beef, and they raise 4,000. So you have a net importation of 11,000 cows. This is in a county that brags that we are the top dairy county in the United States. They're importing 36,000 pigs worth of bacon, more or less self-reliant on lamb, and importing 2 million chickens. The chicken number was of special interest to me. So I said to the Food and Agriculture Group, I said, okay, let's think this through. We have in St. Lawrence County 250,000 acres of abandoned farmland. We have 3,700 people unemployed. We have $6 billion of potentially investable capital, and you're importing every year 2 million chickens. Does anyone see a business opportunity here? Well, flash forward 5 years, no chickens. But they have set up an energy service company that is plugging energy leaks. They have a farm-to-school program that is plugging some of those dairy and beef leaks. Another thing that they're doing, I love this picture. The woman here is the head of the Chamber of Commerce, Karen St. Hilaire. This is a giant monster carp from a local lake that no one will touch, no one will eat in St. Lawrence County. This is a Brit who loves said carp. Idea. Let's invent a great tradition of the carp tournament. So thousands of Brits descend on St. Lawrence County each year for the annual carp tournament. And this has been a great driver in the economy. Now, I want to highlight here that this tourism scheme did well because the local restaurants and hotels are locally owned. If they were chain hotels and restaurants, this scheme would not have worked. Entrepreneurship, lots of things going on with youth entrepreneurs, mentorship programs, incubators. Interesting point, incubators are these physical establishments to help nurture local businesses, or help nurture businesses, we should say. There are 1,000 incubators in North America. That's the good news. The bad news is that nearly all of these incubators are focused on high-tech, nanotech, biotech, what at the end of the day are Tina wannabes. So what happens is that the public pours all this money into these incubators, good companies come out of them, and then they go public and they disappear, and all your money was for naught. We've got to be much more intelligent about how we focus incubators on LOIS and try to create ownership structures around these businesses that come through the incubators. Local business alliances. You know, we've talked already about LOIS shopping malls. We're starting to see ideas of how local businesses come together to do things that they couldn't do alone, production-wise. For example, wind farms. It may be that one farmer can't afford to put up a windmill, but a bunch of farmers could afford to put up a small number of windmills and use that to supplement their income. Producer cooperatives are a very important piece of the puzzle. True value hardware stores have competed effectively against Home Depot, but never have sacrificed their local character. That is, true value hardware stores are all locally owned, but they are members of a national producer cooperative that, just like Home Depot, goes out in the world, scours the universe for good deals, buys in bulk, delivers the savings to their member stores. We need these kinds of arrangements in a lot more categories than hardware. Now, you can do this at a local level too. And an example of this is Tucson Originals. Tucson Originals is a group of food producers in Tucson, Arizona, restaurants and value-added manufacturers of food who work together, buy foodstuffs collectively, buy kitchen equipment collectively in bulk, bring down their costs that way, and thereby improve their competitiveness. Strategy number 4, think local first. No place like home, that's why I have Dorothy up there. Now, I want to talk about this for a second. Every time you're tempted to make an expenditure at a chain store, stop and see if there's a comparable purchase, same quality and price, that you can find at a local business. We're trying to get people to be better shoppers. That's really the essence of this. Here are a bunch of tools that are being used around the country. Coupon books. There's probably 20 cities right now that have these coupon books. This is from Bellingham, Washington. If you use all the coupons in this Where the Locals Go book, you save about $6,400 in your purchases. This is the best-selling book in the local bookstore. This tool actually makes money. And most of these ideas that I'm giving to you, by the way, if they're done properly, they require some investment up front, but they should be money makers. And you then can start building other things off of them. We're seeing labels that are being done, either in a casual or systematic way. These foodstuffs are local, this business is locally owned, this product was made locally. Buy local Weeks, buy local Philly, buy local San Francisco. Local gift cards, debit cards, credit cards. This is a local debit card from Santa Fe, New Mexico. 1 out of 10 residents of Santa Fe now carries this card. Since this card was issued by the Los Alamos Savings Bank, a local bank, that bank has moved from number 4 in Santa Fe to number 1. Because everyone is now moving their deposits into the Los Alamos Bank out of global banks to be part of this. Every time you use your local debit card at a local business, you get a discount that accumulates for further expenditures at other local businesses. Again, this is a project that they expect to generate significant revenue streams down the road. And these streams will then be used to develop other kinds of business alliance activities. Local investing. My my focus in the last couple of years on how to solve this problem with local investing is to create local stock exchanges. If you think about it, unless we help small businesses create local stock, you can't create widespread community ownership in the stock. So local stock is kind of a logical prerequisite for moving towards local ownership of the economy. Well, this is a very interesting story here. The Mercantile in Powell, Wyoming. Powell, Wyoming, tiny town, couldn't attract any chain store to come in. They had no place to buy their socks and their underwear. But they decided, you know what, we're going to build our own general store. They needed money to do it. They needed about $750,000. So they created a small stock issue. They got volunteer legal help to create it. It didn't cost them $100,000. And they sold these stock shares door to door like Girl Scout cookies. They raised their $750,000. This thing has been going profitably now for 5 years. There's a half dozen of these Mercs in the Rocky Mountain states right now. And they are great examples of how creating local stock not only is a great means of capitalizing business, but also a way of building customer loyalty, because the owners, of course, are going to be coming to the store all the time. And the next stage in this is building electronic stock exchanges so that we can help people who own these shares buy and sell them with one another on a local basis. And I've been doing some work with some securities folks around the country on creating this platform. We can talk about this afterwards if anyone is interested. Finally, on local policy making, there's a lot of things here that, we could talk about, but I just want to talk about a couple of things that I think are sort of low-hanging fruit on moving things in the right direction. One is a tax credit. A very small tax credit could make an enormous difference for creating local stock. And I want to give you an example of this. I don't know the law, all the kind of pork things that Pennsylvania has for TINA, but in Maine, we give investors a 40% write-off, a tax credit, not a write-off, a tax credit on every dollar that they put in qualified Maine businesses. What is a qualified Maine business? If you are an advanced TINA manufacturer building a factory in Maine, you qualify. If you are a branch of a TINA bank, you qualify. If you are a local business, you don't qualify. This is crazy, crazy. Old economic development logic, obsolete, disproven. But imagine just tweaking this law ever so slightly, and we simply add one sentence in that says, you also get the 40% tax credit when you invest in local business. Suddenly, all of the investment institutions in the state would move this way. The hedge funds, the mutual funds, the venture funds, the pension funds, everyone would want a piece of this action. Now, we don't even need 40%. 1 or 2% of a tax credit for local investment at a state level would make this kind of difference. Procurement preferences. Can you get Pittsburgh to buy goods and services preferentially locally? There are ways of doing this that I believe are consistent with trade law and also consistent with good free market economics by focusing on the multiplier impacts of local bidders. But you should know that there are 24 communities out there, including Washington, D.C., that give across-the-board preferences to local businesses that compete for municipal or state contracts. Finally, there's the incentives law. Now look, everything that I have shared with you tonight costs something. It costs some money to do leakage analysis, to do entrepreneurship programs, to create business alliances, to create local stock markets. It costs some money to do local first campaigns, at least get them started. But none of these things cost very much money. And if we do them properly, they should be revenue generators, many of them. $50 billion a year is being spent at the local and state level to attract or retain non-local business. That is the vast majority, well over 90% of what is being spent in the name of economic development today. My position is we should simply end the practice across the board and take that money, spend some of it on the things that I've just talked about that are not being done in economic development, except for a few things in entrepreneurship, and give the taxpayers a massive refund on an annual basis with the other money. And I think one can build an interesting and powerful left-right coalition around these ideas. Where I want to leave you is this scene from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. You may recall that after Indiana had suffered through snakes and spiders, terrorists, flying blades, he comes to a crypt with the Holy Grail. And there's a 500-year-old guardian that says, Indiana, your last task will be to choose from among these 50 goblets. Choose from which goblet Christ drank, and choose wisely. Well, at that point, this guy, the German spy, says, I know which one Christ would have drunk from. It would have been the most ornate. He drinks from it, and he spontaneously combusts. At that point, the guardian says, he chose poorly. Well, my argument is that all of us are choosing poorly right now. We're choosing poorly by not doing leakage analysis as an essential part of our economic development. We're choosing poorly as consumers by not buying local first. We're choosing poorly as investors by not thinking about creative ways of putting our pension funds into local business. We're choosing poorly as public policy makers by not weeding out all of these foolish expenditures on attraction and retention that should be focused on local businesses. I think this, in some ways this is a very practical agenda, but this is also a revolutionary one. And that's why I want to quote Patrick Henry with one minor edit from the Revolutionary War. Why stand we here idle? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me community or give me death. Thank you very much. Thank you. Rumor has it we have some microphones for questions. I will make my answers short. If we could do relatively short questions, we'll just try to work our way through whatever people want answered. So grab one of the microphones, just because we're being recorded for posterity and lawsuits.
Hi there. First of all, hi. Thank you so much for this conversation. I grew up in Brookline, Massachusetts.
All right.
Okay, and in Coolidge Corner in particular, where people really care a lot about local businesses and have worked very hard to support the local businesses and community organizations. I've noticed a pattern that's happened in my community. I see it happen in a lot of other places, where the local community, the local economy does so well that they seem to drive the rents so high that they and their constituents end up leaving. And I was wondering if you could speak to maybe what you think is going on there and what you think is about that pattern.
Right. So I mean, what you're talking about is success comes at a price usually, and rising land values will sometimes crowd out the people who made that success possible. And I think, one approach to this is, how do you, in a market-friendly way, keep low-income housing successfully operating in the community? And I think one of the best examples I've seen of this is the Burlington Land Trust. So taking land trusts, and we tend to think of land trusts as contiguous land, but in Burlington and in other places, these are parcels here and there, and one puts them together in a trust, and you give people 100-year leases, and you make sure that the price of housing stays affordable for people over the long haul that way. I mean, if we had done more of this, a lot of today's housing crisis would not have taken place. And I think we also should use that kind of technique, not just for residential land, but also for commercial land. If one wants to do sort of smart growth development and buy all of these sort of gap teeth and neighborhoods, put them together, and then carefully make sure that those lands are nurtured for smart growth rather than the next, chain store boondoggle, you can move economic development in a much better direction.
Over here. Hi.
Hi.
When you were talking about purchasing responsibly, you were saying that if you were talking about buying local first and choosing a product that was a local product if you could, so if there was a local product available. But when it comes to buying food, oftentimes the whole point is that there are foods that are not in season. So you can't have strawberries whenever you want them. You can't have, so I was wondering if you could speak about that for a bit.
Yeah.
Do you think it's at all viable to try to convince consumers to purchase foods that are in season rather than buying whatever they want?
Absolutely, and I think, see, this is where the think local first gets interesting, because really, I was too short in describing it. At the end of the day, I think what Think Local First is about is not just shopping around for the best prices, but shopping around for the smartest way of meeting your needs, okay? And so what you're mentioning is, look, if we can start to teach people that, you can have great meals using seasonally appropriate local ingredients, that is one way of localizing and keeping down your food costs. There are some books out there, recipe books out there. I've done work with a group in New Jersey called Eating Fresh that has a bunch of these recipe books out there, and I think it's a great strategy. But think about it in other areas too. For example, I have a list in the Small-Mart book of sort of the ladder of things that I go through as I think local first. So my top item is not to buy. If I can find a way to borrow it, reuse it, recycle it, dumb down my fashion sensibility, whatever it takes, that's like the best way of saving money and localizing. Healthcare, okay? We have a generation of surgeon generals from both Republican and Democratic administrations who all say exactly the same thing. The way to bring down healthcare costs in this country is to focus on prevention rather than treatment. Well, to the extent that you focus on prevention, you're focusing on local stuff. You're focusing on exercise, good nutrition, all the food systems we're talking about here. We're focusing on, good family counseling and prenatal care, things that are very labor and local service intensive. It's only when you get to later things like end-of-life high-tech equipment or high-tech pharmaceuticals, which are at the treatment phase pretty much, that you get non-local. So doing the right thing in healthcare will bring down costs and necessarily localize ourselves. Or energy is another great example. I mean, Rocky Mountain Institute says that the typical family, even today, is leaving $3,000 a year on the table in unnecessary expenditures on electricity and fuels. And these are things that if we did the cost-effective energy efficiency things, we could save money and localize that money as well. So there's a long list of things like this that if we just approach the need differently, we will save money and localize. There was a baby with a question? Suck local fund first.
Hi there, Michael, thank you. I'd like to compliment you too, or it impressed me about the St. Lawrence study. I was thinking maybe I should move up there and open a chicken farm, you know. However, I have a question related to your comment on affordable in terms of local purchasing, all the ways that you spoke about local, which I'm a big fan of. But I can also say a hidden secret of mine is I'm tempted by dollar stores. And sometimes I go in there. And however, right now I'm speaking about a class split that is an ever-growing problem with the rich getting richer. And I don't mean that $30,000 may not be poor in a lot of our eyes, but over the course of time, it may get a lot poorer. And people are tempted by those big boxes. So how do you say that affordable goes locally when I know that when I go to buy locally, which is a lot of the time, sometimes it's 30% more if, you know, in cost?
Right.
That's
So,
my question.
you know, I guess the first thing I would say is no one should ever spend more money on local goods or services if they don't want or can't afford to. And I believe that across the board. So I have tried to frame my arguments on ways that consumers can genuinely save money. And so the examples you give, it sounds like you've been a careful shopper, and in some things you see that you're not able to find appropriate or good local goods or services, and you should not be buying local on those things. But one of the things that a local first movement can do is it can compile information about lots and lots of things that you as a single shopper will never be able to see on your own. And we have to remind ourselves that our template in our minds about the great deals in box stores is driven by tens of billions of dollars of advertising. So it's definitely had an impact on my thinking as well. But what you realize happens at the box stores is there's a small number of loss leaders, on the corners as you walk in that are significant discounts. And then a lot of the other things are actually not all that different. And sometimes they're more expensive. In Maine, give you an example, every year the state does an analysis of prescription drug prices. And it turns out that local pharmacies have lower prescription drug prices than Walmart or any of the box stores do. The reason is the local stores have a producer cooperative that are buying those drugs in bulk. Now that is data that a good local first campaign gets out to people and moves your needs for people without lots of money a lot closer. So, I just think we should approach local first as a pro-information, pro-market study. We are going to get as much information as we can to people to help them get by better.
Just real quick. So is it your understanding and your research that really believes and knows that local is affordable to you? For instance, produce, clothing. When I buy local clothing, I'm spending a lot more money. When I'm buying local produce now, they're upping their prices constantly because they know it's desirable. So, what is your research in that area?
Right. So the thing is that no generalization will do justice to the question. We've got tens of millions of products tens of millions of services out there. Each are unique. And anyone, whether it's me or, the Mr. Big Box out there, anyone who tries to generalize and say, big is cheaper, local is cheaper, do not believe them. There is no general answer to this. The only answer is there's smart shopping and there's dumb shopping, okay? And what I have seen is that if you're a smart shopper, you can localize 10, 20, 30% of what you're spending at chain stores now and save money. That's been my experience and the experience of many of the communities I work with. Not everything, but let's part of this is also, remember again, retail is a small part of the economic picture, and we're letting retail dominate, okay? But say you buy a cup of coffee. Who's going to argue with a straight face that Starbucks has the cheaper cup of coffee? Who's going to argue with a straight face that the high-end food at Trader Joe's is the cheapest high-end food you're going to find? I mean, I think that we have to bring a lot more detail and nuance to this whole picture, even if we're focusing on retail.
I'd like to put on my buy fresh, buy local hat for this question.
All right.
It's a relatively simple question. Have you seen any communities where, and this buy fresh, buy local, you know about nationally, but we have quite a program here locally to try to get small farmers visible in the retail marketplace. Have you seen any communities across the country where there have been really good efforts to communicate in the local product from local farmers in a mass way that no single farm can do on its own?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think if you look at some of the best Bali networks out there, I mean, Bellingham, Washington is a great one. So one of the things you might do is Bellingham every year, and Bellingham, by the way, is a community of 90,000 people, about an hour and a half drive north of Seattle on the coast. And they have just been working at this for years now. And they have 7 full-time people working on local economy stuff. One of them does food things full-time and does campaigns throughout the community. And every year they do a film or a DVD kind of showing highlights of activities. And food is a very big piece of that. And I think you would get some interesting flavor of what these public campaigns look like from those DVDs. In Philadelphia, you're gonna hopefully come back and listen to Judy Wicks, who is one of the great pioneers of these ideas in Philadelphia. And she has built networks of local restaurants that are increasingly advertising, marketing, purchasing together. And I think it has transformed the food picture of Philadelphia. Your cat, for those of you who don't know, his hat, Buy Fresh, Buy Local, comes from a national organization with, I think they now have maybe 50 to 100 networks around the country called Food Routes. And these networks are all coming up with creative marketing stuff. So we are in a sea of great local food ideas these days. In some ways, food has been the easy one because people sort of get it intuitively, instinctively. They sort of can taste the difference and feel the trust of the health of the local farmer, but it's harder in areas like banking or stock or energy.
I'm wondering, as your ideas kind of take hold and begin some change, we can see some change already happening, but I'm thinking about the nonprofit sector, and do you see any change happening with a movement towards local Will there be any changes in the nonprofit sector? For instance, many nonprofits are funded by large corporations, some local. I mean, here in Pittsburgh we have Heinz, and do a lot of local initiatives. Do you see, what kind of changes do you see in the nonprofit community?
Oh boy, we could spend a few days on that one. So let me begin by just identifying a piece of the nonprofit world that people may not be aware of, which is that the typical American family spends $1,300 on charity a year. Many people foolishly don't spend that money on local charity. And simply localizing those dollars can have an enormous economic impact. So there is another example of where localization costs you nothing, but it gets you some real important dividends beyond just the charity itself. Changes in the nonprofit sector. I think, there's a lot of talk now that wasn't there 20 years ago about nonprofits being more entrepreneurial. But sadly, I think most foundations don't really support it. That is, they talk about, self-reliance and becoming, self-funded, but what they really mean by that is, you're not getting a grant from us, you're getting a grant from them. And we're going to diversify your sources of grant support. That, to me, is a dead end. And I worked in that field for years and years and finally concluded that, nonprofits have some interesting functions to serve in the world, but actually, for-profits are where social change is really at right now. And I think, it's a perversity of American life that we believe somewhere in the back of our minds that for-profits are suspicious and nonprofits are do-gooders. When in fact, the nonprofits are boards of people who elect themselves year after year and have no accountability. Whereas at least there is the possibility in corporations of creating, it's not very good if it's not local, but if you have local firms with local stakeholders, you can create some accountability there. And think about this, if you're really interested in political change, in lobbying, and in pushing politicians, you can't spend any money as a nonprofit, but you can as a for-profit. So, I'm just pointing out the obvious here, I think, that for-profit has a lot of unexploited potential for social change and justice. For me, there was kind of a critical moment where my thinking changed on all this when I was teaching in Japan, and on the way, I spent a few days with my family in Bangkok. And we went to this restaurant called Cabbages and Condoms. Has anyone here heard of Cabbages and Condoms? Okay, 3 people. 3 people who are worldly out there. Cabbages and Condoms is, it's a very large, excellent, and affordable Thai restaurant. Every table has a glass covering with rows of multicolored condoms underneath. There are, blow-up balloon-like animals made out of condoms on the walls. There are slogans, our food won't get you pregnant. At the end of the meal, you get condom mints. And it's really in your face, okay? But this restaurant, along with, I think it's about 15 or so other restaurants, hotels, and resorts that are part of this chain, donates something like, $10 or $20 million a year to reproductive rights and AIDS education in Thailand. It's the biggest movement for trying to curb the AIDS epidemic in Thailand. And as I thought about this, I thought, if this particular restaurant were operating in the United States, first of all, if it was foundation funded, the foundations would say, you think you could tone it down a little bit? You're a little too much in people's face. Or they would say, you know, look, why don't you do an education campaign? You shouldn't be focused so much on the revenue generation side. And the whole thing would have been lost. And I realized, boy, I've been working on the wrong thing all my life. That if you can develop, you know, something that is mission related and revenue generating, it is the home run out there. And that's why in many of the kinds of economic development programs, I mean, I think one of the silliest things about economic development right now is that we give anything to any business, local or non-local, and demand nothing in return. I mean, at a minimum, if you're going to give, you know, $1 million to someone to come in from out of town, why not take an equity stake in the company equal to that and begin to build some equity that allows you to do other things? Instead, we just give this money away pointlessly. And I think we should, you know, we should really start thinking entrepreneurially about economic development.
First of all, thank you very much for your comments tonight. It's really a pleasure to hear you speak. And somewhere nearby, local cabbage stock just went up, so I appreciate it.
All right.
But I guess my question is adjacent to the point you just made in that what's the role of evolving industry standards and certifications?
Yeah. So there's a lot of things out there on industry standards. The one that I have gotten enthusiastic about, but you know, it's still early in the game, is called B Corporation, which should be of special interest to people in this room since it's a Pennsylvania-based company. But what the B Corporation people have done is they, you know, there are many, many different standards out there for social responsibility, and they have created a really nice survey that a company can do within 1 or 2 hours' time and really judge their performance based on these questions on labor standards, environmental standards, charitable standards, governance, corporate governance, and then community. And by the way, you can't score perfectly on the B Corp index unless you're locally owned. So they put local ownership in there as one of the things. But I like what they've done because it's the reasonable compromise between spending millions each year to do kind of your own inventory, which you never can afford to keep up, and doing nothing. And really giving companies some sensibility of how they're performing and steadily improving it. There's an underlying business model of B Corp that, you know, remains to be tested, so we'll see. But it's being, you know, prototyped now around the country. I think there's something like 500 companies that are part of the B Corp network. And there are similar things, you know, internationally that are developing as well. Let me add one other point about this too, which is that at the end of the day, there's only so much you can do with certification. You know, we still need labor and environmental laws. And so while I hate to put, you know, too much burden on the legal side of the house, being a lawyer, I hate lawyers. But I do think that, you know, for things like a living wage, I think living wage laws make some sense. And I know small businesses really detest them. But raising labor standards through a floor on wages is not a bad way of addressing some working poverty out there. And you know, in Santa Fe, New Mexico, they did an across-the-board living wage. They thought it would wreck business. In fact, the economy has thrived after living wages. Because one thing people forgot about living wage, it's Walmart repellent. Chain stores whose model is to pay well below the living wage will not set up anymore in that community. So it has some unintended consequences. Well, we said one last question?
So if markets and public policy are more conducive to local businesses, what do you think will happen to non-local businesses? And also along those lines, what are your thoughts on non-local businesses that attempt to achieve some of the objectives of place-based economies through like corporate social responsibility programs or triple bottom line objectives?
Right. I am 100% supportive of non-local businesses that try to honestly, not through local wash, but honestly try to engage in more localization. So if there are any chain store proprietors or employers or supporters in the audience and you're thinking, well, are there pieces of this we can adapt? Of course there are. Of course there are. In fact, most of the things that I talked about in terms of local supplies and supporting local entrepreneurs and working with local entrepreneurs to bid on larger contracts and bidding on public contracts along with local businesses. I mean, there's all kinds of things that LOIS and TINA can and should be doing in partnership. And we should support that. But we should not be supporting it with public money. Okay? And that's where I draw the distinction. I welcome and embrace all businesses, but I do not embrace public policy that is focusing the dollars on the wrong thing. I think TINA will do fine without public money. I think over time, because of the trends that I mentioned, TINA businesses are going to lose some ground. And in some cases, they're going to lose ground dramatically. But there are some products and some businesses out there that large economies of scale still exist and will exist for a very long time. And they will coexist side by LOIS. To put this in some kind of numerical context, I think, we're probably going to see communities move from 58% local businesses, I think over the next 10 or 20 years, to 70 or 80%. The remainder will be TINA. And actually, and ironically, the volume of trade among many of these players could well go up because localization is a wealth-building strategy. As I get wealthier as a self-reliant community and an individual, I will spend some of my wealth on non-local consumption. So let me give you an example. That I have moved my mortgage in the last 2 years from Bank of America to a local credit union. I saved several $1,000s as a result of doing that. With my savings, I spend some portion of that, I won't tell you how much, on single malt whiskey coming from Scotland. So I have funneled some of that into greater trade, but it's not a very heavy good and high value added. At the same time, I have money that I can invest in all kinds of local businesses, some which are focused on local markets, some of which are focused on global markets. So if every community can add to its wealth through localization, we will see more robust global trade, which raises then the environmental issue, that to get to the kind of world we're looking for, we have to start thinking about other ways of weighting trade against things with high carbon footprints and toward things with low carbon footprints. So we should not be trading in heavy stone from China for construction. That's a nutty thing to trade in. We might, microcircuits, okay, that I can understand. To do that, we need green taxes. We need to move our tax system to carbon taxes. I see that as inevitable. And if we can start doing that at the local level, it would be a great step in the right direction. So I've strung together a lot of different things here to answer your question. But the bottom line that I want to give, and maybe we'll conclude on this note, is that localization has been burlesqued for a generation as people spending more on things that they don't really need. And in fact, the smarter way of doing localization is to be a better shopper, a better investor, a better planner, and spend on those things that are going to generate more wealth locally. And if you do that right and combine it with the other public policies, we have a shot, not a guarantee, but a shot of moving our economies and moving our sustainability in the right direction. Thank you again for coming this evening.